Are these even on? Whoa, they are on. Hi there. All right. For those of you in the back, it's time to stop talking. Welcome. This is the Relationships with Investors panel. I'm Seth Levine, your moderator. I'm a partner and a co-founder of Foundry. I'm going to ask a lot of questions. I'm going to first introduce the group. But I wanted to say a couple of things before we jumped into that. The first is we're going to try to make this lively and maybe a little bit funny, who knows. And so there's going to be some Q&A from the audience towards the end, but I would encourage you to just shout questions if someone answers something and you're like, that sounded like BS, or I don't even understand what that means, or that sounded like VC speak or something like that. Just like yell out, hey, could you elaborate? Or hey, how about this? So let's go with that. Gosh, I got both hands full. Wasn't expecting that. All right, so better not need that one again. Let me intro down the line. So Kirk, you don't have an intro card. Oh. I lost it. Maybe it's that one. No, that's blank. Yeah, Kirk, that's your intro card. Kirk is a partner at Access Ventures. He's been a venture capitalist for, I'm going to say 24 years. I'm pretty close. And I know that because I'm only a couple years behind him. And before that, he was a founding partner at Vista Ventures. So Kirk is like OG VC in Colorado. Fun fact about Kirk is the first, it's really me and Kirk, the first investment that I ever got to make sort of all on my own as a VC was a co-investment with Kirk, and it remains to this day the best IRR I've ever had. We sold the company in 6 months for 3 times our money. It was great. Natty. I don't even know why I need to look at these cards. I've known all of you for like 20 years. So Natty is a partner at Matchstick Ventures, which is a Boulder and Minneapolis-based venture firm. Outstanding. Many of you, I'm sure, know his partner, Ryan. Before that, Natty was the MD of the Techstars Boulder program. And in Techstars, he invested in over 100 companies. And before that, he was the founder of a startup called Everlater in the travel business that was sold to AOL. Fun fact about Natty and me is that I was his Techstars mentor back when he and his partner were doing Everlater, which was very fun. Lee is the co-founder and CEO of Havenly. Havenly makes designing rooms in your home fun, easy, and accessible. They also own the brands The Inside and Interior Define, which they bought 6 months ago, something like that. Those are actual stores you can walk into. So we're internet and real life stuff. Fun fact about me and Lee, which Lee may not even know. Well, you know this part, which is that we first met at Foundry, and then we had an argument internally about who got to be on your board. And I lost, you won, because my partner Jason got to be on the board. Oh,
that's fun. I did not know that.
That is true, yeah, so we learned that. And then lastly is Jeremy Bloom. Jeremy is the co-founder and CEO of Integrate. Integrate is a software marketing business. They help companies orchestrate their demand funnel, basically top of funnel demand. They also have a media business, so they help create that demand as well. And that company was sold to a private equity firm, Audex, in 2000 something. December of 2021. I should know that. I was an investor. It was a great return. A fun fact about Jeremy is that if you combine me and Jeremy, we've actually together won 11 World Cup gold medals. We've also participated in 2 combined Olympics, which is pretty cool. 2 Olympics for you and none for me, but we average out at 1, so, that's not so bad.
I'm still waiting on my carry from all his funds. If we're sharing things, I'll take half of your carry.
I'll also call it that's some good venture math right there.
Hey, Jeff Bezos walks into a room and we're all billionaires on average. All right, so let's start with some Q&A. So we're here to talk about the relationship between companies probably could have intermixed you a little bit, and their VCs. And then there's a couple of us, I guess, that are on kind of both sides of that. Natty, you are a VC now. You were at a company. So let's start with you, Natty, because I'm interested in your perspective on this. So when you first meet a VC as a startup, you're pitching them, right? So you have a certain relationship, which is please give me money, and let me tell you how great I am. And then the relationship shifts, because when they eventually say yes, hopefully, then they're an investor, and maybe they're on your board, but obviously they're on your side. Could you talk a little bit about that transition?
Yeah. I would say the way I think about it is that these are partnerships, and partnerships start with authenticity and a real relationship. So I think you're right that at the early phases, you're kind of pitching an investor, but the best way I think to get an investment is actually to not pitch. It's to be yourself. It's to be authentic. It's to share really what you're working on, maybe even being somewhat vulnerable. And if you do that in the pitch process, I think you're actually more likely to get investment. And then when you transition to be an investee, whatever you want to call it, you've already set the groundwork for the type of relationship you're going to have. I think that's kind of hard to do. I think that there are inherent power dynamics between investors and founders, sort of through the history of how the industry has come about. One of the pieces of advice I give to founders is VCs need you to be in business. And so if you can shift your mindset from, hey, I'm not lucky to maybe earn investment from this investor, but this investor is lucky that I'm offering them the chance to buy equity in my company at the earliest stage for the cheapest it hopefully will ever be. Maybe you can go into that room with a little bit more confidence, a little bit more openness, so that you build a really good relationship from that pitch phase. I'm a seed stage investor, so I think this is especially important at seed, where you're really investing in a team and a dream, not so much the metrics. And so, I don't know, for me, it kind of starts from even when you're trying to seek investment, of just bringing that authenticity into the room or into the meeting.
I love that you've been a VC for like 4 or 5 years now, and you already have perfected the art of not actually answering the question that was asked. So, awesome. So we're going to try this again and see if I can get an answer to that question. So Lee, why don't you give us your perspective on when the tables turn, how do you do that? And actually, let me ask a very specific question about that, which is people often talk about that first board meeting. Right, and we actually sometimes joke inside Foundry as sort of like when you get back from the first board meeting, like, okay, what did we really learn? Like, what did we not know, or what rock did we not turn over? So maybe talk about the overall dynamic, and then specifically that first board meeting.
That's great. Now I will very much try and answer the question. So overall,
if you don't, I got 2 more panelists. So we're gonna get someone's going to answer the question.
Can I get an audience vote? Did I answer the question or not? Be honest. Thumbs up if I answered it.
Natty, you're not winning that
hold
one.
on. Everyone needs to put the thumb in the air. Did you answer it? Did I answer it? Yes. Or down?
Run for office.
Okay, I guess I didn't. Okay.
We'll try again, Natty. So overall dynamic, I think, initially you're kind of trying to figure it out. I mean, over time you sort of do this, you understand the investor landscape a little bit more. It's a bit like your friends. Like, you've got different circles of friends. You've got friends that are really close to you that can support you and you turn to all the time. And then, the spectrum goes all the way to like the friend that's like super, super annoying. And that happens with investors too. And so like, that investor you're trying to, manage in a different way than the person that is sort of getting in with you and getting in the trenches and can be really supportive going forward. Same dynamic. What's funny is in that first board meeting, you don't know. So that first time after someone has made an investment in you, particularly in your first stages, you don't actually know that dynamic exists as viscerally as I do now. So you don't realize that there's, sort of a scale of investors and how they interact with you will differ and how you think about them differ. So in that first board meeting, you often walk in like, can I curse? I was like...
Fuck no. No fucking cursing in this room.
No fucking cursing. Good. Fuck. I was really fucking scared. I was like, gosh, like I pitched them on this thing, but like, every CEO knows. I mean, you can ask me. I probably won't tell you, but like, you can ask me, and in my head, I will tell you what all of the problems in my business are. I know all of them. I dream about them every single fucking night. And like, you go in, and you don't show that always in the pitch process. You do. Like, I think I'm a pretty straightforward person, if you know me at all. You'll probably agree that that's true. But still, and you walk in, and you're like, will I be exposed? Like I felt like an imposter. I think that's something that like was maybe pretty common for people. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to pitch again. And it's not very helpful. That first board meeting was not a very helpful board meeting, I'd imagine, for anyone but myself. Because what I learned there is actually, like, these people aren't out to get me. They're looking for a return on their investment. They're looking to be helpful. And I was lucky at the time to have a very excellent and supportive board. I have at times not, as you know, had excellent and supportive boards, and that's a bit of a different dynamic. But you know, it sort of evolves over time.
I don't think you're going to get away with not talking about that later, though. I've got a question for you. Kirk, you have something to add?
I was going to, I call that the oh shit board meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's try to avoid those. We'll talk more about that in a second. Let's talk about communication. Jeremy, I want you to address this, and I'm thinking about it from sort of two sides. So one is, I think you do an excellent job of communicating with your company, and maybe talk a little bit about, I still get Jeremy's kind of Friday CEO note. And I find it a great way to just kind of keep up on what's going on. He usually has a couple pictures. That's helpful for me because I know. But also includes some words and some thoughts on what's going on. So I'd love you to talk about that. But I'd also like you to talk about then external communication. How do you communicate with your investors? And we're going to dig into that a little bit more deeply. So just give us kind of the overview, and then we'll jump in with some follow-up.
Yeah, that sounds good. Hi, everybody. It's great to see a full room, and go Buffs while I'm here.
Go Buffs.
Go Buffs.
Yeah, so I've always believed in transparency. I've always believed in, being real and upfront with people, even when it's bad news. And I think the people you want to have on your team stick around. And I think there's this gravitational pull as leaders to sort of modify your words a little bit, or kind of modify your behavior and only talk about the wins and sort of, brush aside the gaps. I like to sort of flip that on its head. I like to spend a lot of time on the gaps and talk about, hey, collectively, how do we go and solve this? And I kind of experienced an environment in my life where I didn't have that, and I experienced one where I did, before I started a company that I really, sort of looked to. I was drafted by the Philadelphia Eagles, and I spent a couple seasons there and a season with the Pittsburgh Steelers. Andy Reid drafted me. He was the head coach of the Kansas City Chiefs. Go Broncos! But his organization was very top down and no transparency. So as a player, sort of in the Eagles, when I was playing, you never knew where you stood. You'd be in meetings and even position meetings, and you never really got a grasp for what front office was thinking. And it was always like this big divide between player and front office. And I think I didn't like that, and I don't think a lot of my teammates did either. And when I went to the Steelers, it was just the complete opposite. It was bottoms up. Mike Tomlin's a great leader. The Rooneys have owned that team forever. You always knew where you stood, and Mike Tomlin would tell you exactly where you stood. And sometimes, bring your big boy pants into that meeting, because you need thick skin in order to have that type of candor. But I really deeply believe in it, and I believe in radical candor. There's a great book by Kim Scott, if you've read it, about radical candor. There's ways to be constructive in your candor, and there's ways to be really destructive in your candor, and I think it's really important to understand the differences. But I think radical candor in a constructive way is a really powerful force in building a team to go accomplish something difficult.
Yeah, love that.
It is important to note, by the way, that now between Jeremy and I, we have 2 professional football teams under our belt. But I will, beyond that, I think what's interesting, about what Jeremy said there is the confronting the negative stuff. I didn't realize I did this. I didn't even realize I did this. I do this because it relieves me of the burden. It relieves me of the burden of sitting there in my head being like, oh my God, there's a scary thing about to happen. And it puts it out there. You can name it, you can tackle it. You have people who will come in with you to tackle it. And it's a really powerful tool to sort of survive what I think are the vicissitudes of your time as a founder.
I think that gets to the core of the challenge of the shift that we were talking about in the very first question, which is that it's easy to forget that you're on the same side, right? And that investors want what's best for the company, right? Now, I'm not saying there aren't times when investors and management team can't be crosswise, either in terms of economic incentives or something else. But generally speaking, right, they want the best thing for the business as you do, right? So they're there to help absorb some of that stress, right? No one wants CEOs up all night, worrying about things. Kirk, let me ask you kind of an age-old question in venture and get your thoughts on this. And maybe we'll use it to kind of dig into some sort of board meeting best practices. And then, Natty, maybe follow up on this because you've been on both sides on board meetings. Should companies, CEOs call every board member before every board meeting? What's your thought on that? And in general, just give us a couple of thoughts other than they should read my excellent blog series on productive board meetings. But other than that, what should people be thinking about how to run good board meetings, which is really kind of an epicenter for, obviously, a communication between at least a subset of investors and the company.
You should definitely read that blog, everyone. It's excellent.
Thank you. You should also read it when you get a chance.
The answer to your specific question, so I don't get the thumbs down, is no, I don't think you need to call your board members before every board meeting. But what you should be doing is communicating with them regularly in between board meetings. And that could be written, as Jeremy was talking about, or Seth was talking about how Jeremy does it every Friday. We've got a call out for one of our CEOs, Ryan Bourne. You probably get his update every week, quick half page of how the business is doing. That's super helpful. But you mentioned the word team, Seth, and for me, the communication piece with board members comes a lot down to the team. So the advice I give my CEOs is, when you have that board, think about us, and I always think of Tim Miller from Rally, real servant leader type of person, but he expected us on the Rally board to serve him and serve the company. So if you have your board members approach it as, I'm working for you, CEO, and I'm on your team, then it's your job as the CEO to understand the strengths and weaknesses, the communication patterns that work best for each of your board members. I always also say, investors are not robots. We're human beings. The way I interact with an entrepreneur is different than Seth. It's different than Natty. You as CEO, it's your responsibility and co-responsibility with your board member and your investor to understand how to best communicate in between board meetings and build a relationship, as Natty was talking about.
Can I build on the question?
Sure.
So Seth was on my board for 11 years. So you go through lots of different stages as a business. Early days, it was sort of us going to Starbucks and just catching up, and it was pretty easy. But as the board got bigger, there's few things less productive than going 1 through 12 on a slide deck or 1 through 50. And there's few things less productive. And so we flipped the tables, and what we started doing is I asked each one of my C team members to write sort of the State of the Union, just one page, marketing, sales, finance, et cetera, and we would package that up and we'd send it to the board sort of 4 days before the board meeting. Each functional leader was allowed 1 or maybe 2 slides, and then everything else went in the appendix. And we would open the board meeting after sort of approving the last board minutes, et cetera, with Q&A from the board. So they were expected to read the State of the Union letter, take a look at the 1 or 2 slides, look at the appendix, and come prepared for questions. And then those questions would always lead you to different slides. Oh, great question. Let's go to slide 26 in the appendix. Here's what we're seeing there. And everyone was more engaged. My team was more engaged. The investors were more engaged. And we were able to actually get board meetings done quicker. So instead of 3 hours, we moved it to like an hour and a half. And over that hour and a half, everybody just felt better because it was more dynamic and less monotonous.
Yeah, and put it a different way, we shifted some of the board work from being in the meeting where we're all together to being ahead of the meeting. And it was interesting, especially the very first time we did that. It really exposed, you want to expose whether someone's read the board package or not. You start with, not with the slide deck presentation, but with the, all right, we've already read anything. What questions do you have? Exactly, so.
One little add on that I've seen 1 or 2 of our companies do is they actually expect you the day before, like 24 hours before the board meeting, you have to send the questions in advance to the group. So everyone sees the questions and then everyone knows that you read the board package thoroughly like a day in advance.
I have a company that does that, and we do it in the Google Doc, and I would say 2/3 of the board meetings, I go through and I spend all this time and I write up the questions, so I get to the board meeting, and I'm like, so you saw my questions? They're like, oh no, forgot to reopen the Google Doc. I may be the only one who's doing it. Natty, I want to throw it to you for the second half of that question. It's an opportunity to redeem yourself.
What's the
So I'm
question?
going to ask the question very clearly. No. Let's talk a little bit about, I don't even remember the question, but I'm going to make a new one up. But let's talk about sort of, you've had experience on both sides of the table, being the co-CEO of a company and then being obviously on the board as a venture investor. Talk a little bit about the differences that you've observed and sort of how you've evolved your thinking, having had experience on both sides.
I think my evolution, my thinking is like, what's the point of this relationship between a founder and an investor? And it's to collaboratively achieve the potential of the company and the founders or the team around it. And so the reason why I define it that way is I think in a healthy relationship, we are collaboratively working together, whether you're the CEO or the management team or the founders or the investors, to achieve the potential. That doesn't necessarily mean everyone's always aligned, but if we want to achieve that, we need to have candid conversations. We need to make sure we're talking about the key issues. We need to make sure everyone is up to speed on what's going on in the business. And it's the responsibility of all those parties to make sure we're talking about the most important things for the business at that time. And so that is what I think that's what the goal here is. It's not that the investor, that's the way that an investor maximizes their return, which is their job. That's the way that the founder achieves their dreams or their goals for the company. And so in a healthy dynamic of a relationship, there's alignment in what we're trying to do there. But the only way you can get there is with that honest, confronting the brutal facts mindset of teaming up to figure that out.
So let's talk a little bit about, and then we'll move on from boards, but let's talk a little bit about board challenges. And this is going to be both, JB, for you and for Lee. Lee, let's start with you, because both of you have had challenges on your board, right, where someone needed to leave. I don't know how much detail you want or can give, but talk about that, at least the concept of how you had to reshape the board a little bit, and then we completely reshaped the Integrate board at one point, and maybe talk about that.
Yeah, it's your board. So, by the way, when you take investment dollars, not everyone will have a huge influence on you. And this is maybe something important to note. Like, you want to be thoughtful about the individuals that you take enough money from or require you to put them on your board, because those are the individuals that will end up shaping, I think, your experience as a founder and a CEO and on a company. And it can come about in two ways. So it can come about in ways that are a little bit more obvious. They don't approve certain financings. They won't approve a sale you want to do. They get involved in hiring and firing decisions, et cetera. It could also come about in interpersonal conflict. So in other words, said another way, someone can just be a dick. And that is really, really hard, because the one thing, so everyone's talking about how investors are here to support you and they're here to help and they're on your team, but sometimes they're actually not. And that really sucks, because that means every quarter you're showing up and that person will have an agenda that isn't your agenda, that isn't about your company, that has nothing to do in many cases with how you're doing or what you should be doing, but is there for some other reason. And for me, that happened, unfortunately, with a round of financing I took with an individual. This is pretty public, so I think I just don't tweet about it or X about it or whatever. But is that what we call it? Is it still tweeting? I don't know.
Xing sounds very weird.
Yeah, it's.
Yeah, so I think we'll call it tweeting.
Yeah, let's keep it at tweeting.
Musking.
Thank you. Yes. Musking.
No? God, Muffin Top the other day, and now Musk. Okay.
Yeah,
I'm really getting myself in trouble up on this stage.
You're going to say moist now, aren't you? Also a cringy word.
Musk is the guy's name who owns it, right?
Yeah. I know. So I think, what that meant was there's a lot of stress going into a board meeting. The board meetings were completely unhelpful. I remember we had a conversation with Jason Mendelsohn, who was on my board, and this board member. 2 hours of the 2.5-hour board meeting were about whether or not you could build a big enough company in Colorado, which, by the way, was completely, at the time we were teeny tiny, had nothing to do with what we were doing, had nothing to do with anything that we'd done or needed, or it was literally just someone, coming in with some sort of an ego about something, feeling like he needed to prove something over some other board member. Sat there in silence for 2.5 hours, me and my independent board member. I walked out of that meeting and I was like, this really sucks. I don't know if I'm gonna make it as doing the CEO thing, if that's gonna be the case. The individual, then it came out that he was pretty much serially sexually harassing women. So would exchange, attempt to exchange sexual get sexual favors in exchange for funding. And he was sort of the first shoe to drop in the VC Me Too case, which actually preceded Harvey Weinstein. So it was a little bit earlier in 2017. And, what's funny about that is some of these things you like to think about it, like, is it true? Do you know this? And like this person, I was like, he's such a dick, I totally believe it. It was like, and in that process, we had to remove him from the board. Obviously, I'm a woman. I have a 70% female company. Like, it's like none of that resonated with me, and I was able to sort of do some things. But it is very hard to get named individuals off the board. I'm curious how people do it in other circumstances. Typically a very difficult process, but we were able to sort of enact it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, because I know how difficult that time was.
Yeah, it wasn't fun.
Jeremy, let's talk a little bit about board transition at Integrate a little bit.
Yeah, we went through a lot of transitions. Integrate probably should have failed at least once, maybe twice, maybe 3 times. But we went through some tricky times. My co-founder, who was sort of one of my best friends at the time, broke probably every fiduciary responsibility as a board member that you possibly could. So that divorce was really, really messy, and that's certainly changed the board dynamics of the business. And then we raised our Series B, and from a big firm, but we got sort of a junior board member, and I try to avoid people who are reactive. Because as companies, you're going to go through all these twists and turns, and things are going to work, and things aren't going to work, and are we going to run out of cash? Are we not going to run out of cash? And if somebody junior is trying to make their way up in an organization and they're sort of like evaluated just on that one company, that's a lot of pressure to put on that individual and on the company. And I think what we realized, great human being, bad board member, very reactive. So anytime that there was negative news or not a clear path to like a huge exit, he became a big distraction to me and the operating team. So I think who you have in that most strategic room is really important. What their personality is, how do they deal with conflict, how do they deal with things that aren't working well, and so we ultimately had to ask him to step off, and wasn't the easiest of conversations, but it wasn't the hardest either. I think ultimately it's our job to do what's best for the business, and if that means having tough conversations and being respectful and caring, like it's not a personal thing, but this is not best for the business, and I think we need to talk about it. I think we always need to be having those conversations with our board members, with our employees, with our investors, or whoever. Avoiding those conversations just prolongs the problem and probably deepens the problem as well.
I think it's such a good, important point that I just want to reiterate to everyone, which is that sometimes it's hard to have those conversations, right? But it's the job of an effective board, of a productive board member, of a productive investor, to be willing to have the difficult conversations in a way that is authentic and respectful, but also very direct. Last thing I would say on boards is I think people often confuse, especially people on our side of the table, venture side of the table, confuse discussion topics with decision topics. Boards don't run companies, and for the most part, most of what happens in a board meeting is providing input to the management team who ultimately makes the decision. And I often find that board members confuse that, and it seems to be not correlated with how long they've been in the venture or private equity business. And so I sometimes find myself stopping a discussion or interjecting into a discussion in a board meeting and saying, hey, Lee, can we just clarify, this is a discussion topic, right, not a decision topic. You're looking for input, but you're making this decision. This isn't a board decision. And I think that can sometimes be a helpful way to clarify roles around the table, which I think can be helpful. All right, so we're going to hit pause just for a sec, kind of switch up the cadence. We're going to do some quick hit questions. We've got 4 panelists, so I'm going to do maybe just a couple for each, just to get to know you guys a little bit better. And these are intended to be kind of 1-word or maybe 1-sentence answers. But if you get in the second sentence, I'm going to buzz you and you can't keep talking. So we'll just go down the line. Kirk, in your bio, you say that you like playing any sport you can play at your age. That's a quote. What's the best sport for old guys like us?
Golf.
0 for 1, okay.
Skiing.
Skiing, there you go. Much better. So, Kirk, you got your MBA at Stanford. You've lived, obviously, in the Denver area for now over 20 years. Mountains or beach?
What's that?
Mountains or beach?
Mountains.
Amen to that, brother. Okay. If you were not a VC, what would you be doing?
playing on the PGA Tour.
Wow, that's good. Okay, final question. Nuggets repeat this year? Yes or no?
Yes, sir.
Such a layup crowd pleaser. All right. I got to read my own handwriting here, Natty. This is difficult. Okay. Natty, you grew up in Colorado, but you spent a lot of time now in Minneapolis, in Minnesota. Colorado or Minnesota?
Colorado.
Also a layup. So easy. Look at that. Do you sleep less or more as a VC versus a company founder?
Same. I don't sleep.
Oh, wow.
I'm sorry. I'm a bad sleeper. If anyone has advice, I'm not a good sleeper. No, I would say I sleep more as a VC.
Got it. I know you are an accomplished runner. You ran in college. What's your fastest 1 mile time ever?
My mile's not my fastest, but 420. Go Colorado.
Wow.
Wow.
I stopped at 420 on purpose.
Just to clarify, what would your mile time be now?
620.
Okay, thank God it was over 6 minutes. Okay, good. Last question for you. Matchstick has a famously awesome swag store. It's one of many reasons you might want to take money from Matchstick. What's your favorite piece of swag from your store?
My favorite swag is a mirror water bottle. I know it's kind of lame. We do much cooler stuff, but the Yeti ones are too fat. They don't fit in cup holders. The mirror ones are these tall, thin ones that I'm obsessed with. But
I want me one of those. By the way, I met Pam's sister your wife's sister out riding the other day because she was wearing a Matchstick.
Our cycling gear is pretty good too.
cycling thing, and I was like, "Who are you?"
I'm a VC from Boulder. Can't not make your own custom cycling kits.
Yeah, it's true. Integrate has a nice one too. Okay, Lee. All right, you obviously own a design firm, Havenly. Have you used Havenly to design a room, and if so, which one?
I have all of them, please.
I love it. What's your favorite city to travel to for business, other than Denver?
Other than Denver.
You could say Boulder, I guess.
Probably, definitely not Boulder. I have thoughts on Boulder, but New York, probably. It's fun.
Well, yeah.
You know, expense account, nice
How
dinner.
long did you live in New York?
13 years.
Yeah, okay, so you have a lot of experience
Don't
there.
ask me the question because I'm going to get it wrong and I'm going to get booed.
It's all good.
Okay.
No, I'm not going to say it. What's your favorite non-business book?
I am a notorious reader of two genres, Russian satires and British mid-century murder mysteries. So it's between Master and Margarita, or probably The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie.
Show of hands, who in this room have read either of those books? Oh, wow.
Look at that.
We have a learned group.
We have a reading group.
That is awesome. Okay, last question. Will the Broncos win more than 4 games this year?
You're talking about sports ball? Sure.
I'm not so sure. I can ask Jeremy that question too, maybe. All right, JB, you ski sometimes. What's your favorite mountain to ski in Colorado?
Telluride.
We were planning a ski thing for the Foundry CEOs once, and we sent a note out saying, hey, would anyone like to join us for the ski thing? And Jeremy just sends back a note that says, I like to ski. I thought it was very funny. All right, so you, amongst other things, you started a foundation called Wish of a Lifetime. If you haven't heard of it, you should look it up. It's absolutely amazing. They grant wishes to seniors. It's a really remarkable organization. What's your favorite wish that Wish has granted?
We've granted thousands of wishes, but a common wish is reconnection. This is going to go longer than a word, right?
Okay, you can go. I'm not going to buzz you. I don't even have a buzzer. No one noticed that.
We reconnect a lot of people in life. One person reached out and said, my wish of a lifetime is to see my 2 sisters. Not uncommon. She was the youngest. She was 104. The oldest was 109. 3 centenarian sisters who hadn't seen each other in 15 years. We reunited them.
Oh my God, it's awesome. Fantastic. I want to come pinch your cheek. That's amazing. Oh, sorry, last question. I forgot to ask the most important one. No pressure here, but where will the Buffs end the season in the college rankings? Excuse me.
National champions, baby. Just kidding.
He believes.
Okay. Alrighty. Well, then will the Broncos win more than 4 games?
Go Buffs.
There you go. All right. So bring it back down, back to real questions. This is for Jeremy and for Lee. Can you give us some examples of when you really relied on an investor? And I'm looking for as specific as possible so people can get, and maybe several examples of like, hey, here are some things that happened over the course of the last, whatever, 10 years of running each of your businesses where I really leaned on investors, not even necessarily board members, but just investors writ large?
I'll give you two. One good one, one bad one. The bad one was we broke a loan covenant from SVB. This was early days, and we didn't have a lot of cash in the bank. I'm a first-time founder, and at that time, I had no idea what breaking a loan covenant even meant, and I didn't understand what a big deal it was. It's a big deal. And at the time, the business wasn't doing so well. And when you break a loan covenant, SVB can come in and call all your receivables and shut down the business, which is probably the most likely thing that was going to happen to us. And I called one of my friends, Bill Maris. Bill Maris started Google Ventures, really sharp guy. I said, hey, I'm in a tricky spot. What do you think I should do? And I told him what was going on, and he said, you got to flip the tables immediately. I said, what do you mean? What do you mean by that? He says, you got to create a couple slides of some momentum in the business, and then you have to ask them to modify the loan covenants within 24 hours, or you're shutting down the business yourself. And that took a lot of courage to go into that meeting, because we didn't have a lot of leverage. And we played that game plan, and they were like, whoa, no. And they modified the loan covenants within 24 hours, gave us a $2 million bridge loan. We worked it out. Seth gave us some money from an inside round, and we made it through it. But it was pretty difficult, and without the guidance, I think it would have been harder. The second one is sort of upon exit. We had 4 offers to buy the business, all good offers, private equity offers, and this guy was such a great partner throughout that process of like, how should we be thinking about this? We also had a really messy cap table. We had to get yeses from a lot of people. That was really tricky, and really leaned heavily on Seth through that process to ultimately drive to a good outcome.
I'll leave my SVB loan covenant story out. I feel like that's actually a really important place to use investors, by the way. It's funny. I feel like I've had so many in the last year in particular. Venture has been, a different world over the last year. So I'll pick a couple, actually both good. The first is, one of the things that we're doing, as Seth alluded to, is we actually are buying some of the distressed companies in our space. So there are lots of these brands that are great brands, but they got venture funded. They're never going to make it. They're out of cash. And we're bringing them into our portfolio because we can sell them through our design platform. It sort of makes sense for us. But it's actually tricky to do, in particular when you're dealing with distress. You've got banks. In this case, you had SVB and a bank called Horizon. You have investors, all of whom are going to go to zero. You have, employees, the other CEO. There's just like a lot of constituents involved. And leaning on your investors to basically solve the problems that they're really well equipped to solve. So, for example, Brad Feld, who's on our board from Foundry, was really in the trenches with me on a number of things. And Seth, by the way, was really helpful in the same vein on both how we structure the deal. So, we're sort of limiting our liability, how we deal with the banks, et cetera, et cetera. And then, I went to a couple of other individuals on my board for advice on resurrecting the brand and things of that nature. But like, when you think about it, we did this incredibly distressed deal, and I want to tell you when I did it. I got the call the Sunday of Thanksgiving, and I closed, and I had to loan the company money on December 14th to make payroll. So I had to do that all in 2 weeks. It would have been physically impossible. And then we closed a round of financing, which on like Christmas Day of 2022, in like one of the driest fundraising markets there was. I could not have gotten that done without a lot of help from my board members. Brad was the only person that would pick up my phone call on December 25th, as it turned out, when like the deal was falling apart, and that's like pretty amazing. I think the amount of work that they did for me was tremendous. And by the way, that deal was pretty transformative for the company in a lot of ways. So that's one. I also will say I rely on my board a lot more now, and different members of my board for emotional support. It's been a little bit of a tough personal year for me for a variety of reasons. Also, tough from a personal perspective because we lost the co-founder of Havenly to cancer very recently. I hadn't known about it for very long. But I have an independent board member who has been a founder before and been in these situations and sits on a lot of boards. And like the ability to call them up and be like, I'm really, I'm struggling with the day-to-day. I'm struggling with what I should be doing with my life. What's important. And like, people don't talk about the mental health of founders. They do more now, I think, but there is like a really big psychological component, particularly when you're in it for the long run. And I think having people like that can sort of come in with outside perspective. I can't tell anyone on my team like I'm struggling. I could, but the dynamic's a little different than a board member who's like, and just seeing how much he's supported me and been there on that side of things, which is, by the way, not what you think of when you think of board members, right? But it really is and has been a materially important part of the folks around the table for me.
That point is so important, and it reminds me of something. I hadn't thought about this in a long time, but we had one of our CEO forums, basically, and we were chatting. It was early on in Foundry, so it was a pretty small group. This was maybe 10 years ago. And one of our CEOs said something to the effect of, like, being a CEO is like the most lonely job in the world. And he described he'd lost the ability to have, like, highs and lows. And he talked through this so eloquently. I'm not going to do it justice, but essentially, like, because of the day-to-day, like, there's always something amazing and something, fucked up. And he had lost the ability to, like, celebrate the good things because he was protecting himself from not feeling too badly about the bad things. And I think calling that out and having the whole group talk about that and just acknowledge it, I thought was one of the most powerful moments I think I've experienced with a group of CEOs in 20-something years in venture. And I'm glad you called that out. No, that's great. Kirk, I'm curious to have you give some advice to people about, there are different types of investors. So you've got investors that are on your board. You have investors that are major investors, which is a defined term usually in most deals, where they have certain, they've bought enough shares or invested enough money, they have certain information rights. So that's another set. And then you've got oftentimes some smaller investors, right? Those might even be former employees that exercised stock options, things like that. I think companies often struggle with sort of how to communicate effectively across those groups. And I'm wondering if you've got any advice to that. And then I'll jump it over to whoever wants to jump in as well. I think it's an important enough topic to get a couple perspectives on.
Yeah, a couple thoughts on that, Seth. You hear a lot of people saying, you don't want a big cap table here at all time, or you want a small board. And I kind of tend to have the opposite perspective over my career, which is, maybe it's because my grandmother from Mississippi, the more the merrier. We always had like 30 people over for lunch on Sundays. So I've always been a more the merrier type of person, but that's harder to manage as a CEO, and I appreciate that. But one of the pieces of advice I give them, and a call out to Kristen Langenfeld, our CEO of Goodbye Gear, she is fucking amazing at this, because we have a large cap table at Goodbye Gear. Back to what I said earlier, it's understand who's on your team, and then leverage their strengths, and you probably don't need to coach them on their weaknesses, but leverage their strengths and leverage their advice. And understand who to go to for what advice. I do find a lot of CEOs tend to kind of throw, even in the boardroom, throw out the question for advice for all their board members. In reality, kind of behind the scenes in that other communication between board members, they should say, Seth's really good at this, and Jeremy, my independent board member, is awesome at this. I'm going to go ask those two. So I'm going to select who I get that input from. The one negative things about investors, and frankly a lot of VCs, is a lot of them have a hard time admitting that they don't know something. There's a lot of ego involved. And you'll ask them a question, and they'll talk for 10 minutes and give you the answer when they don't know what the fuck they're talking about. They haven't even experienced what the question that you asked them about. So understanding who your investors are, knowing where to leverage and who to ask for help is a key thing I think you should do as CEO.
I think one of the worst cliches in venture, 15 minutes. One of the worst cliches in venture, and I hear this all the time because we have a fund-to-funds practice now, so we invest in other funds, including Matchstick, actually. And the number of times I hear people say, well, we want to be the first phone call. And I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. So you want to be the first phone call on every single thing that comes up at that company? Like, how bad are the boards that you're on? That you're the best person to talk about HR, marketing, finance, M&A, whatever. Like, that's ridiculous. And so I think this idea of, like, you build boards to have a diversity of expertise, a diversity of experience, that's critical. And then as a CEO, it's your job, and as a board member for that matter, it's your job to understand, okay, well, when I have an HR question, this is the person I'm going to call. When I'm struggling with marketing or go-to-market, this is the person I'm going to call. Such a good point. Thanks for bringing that up, Kirk. Who else wants to jump in on that? Because I think this idea of, I do think CEOs struggle with sort of like, how much information do I give this like former employee that has 1,000 shares that they exercised versus, or even someone who invested maybe $25,000 in my seed round, and that's a lot of money for them, right? So it's not to minimize that, but they don't have information rights, and what do I do? Anyone want to wade into that?
I think it's actually like, I don't disagree. I mean, cap tables are cap tables. You have them over time. You'll get more and more people on them. So it is what it is. I think I do take a slightly different perspective. I think because like the reality is after time, that $25,000 investor that invested years ago is maybe not as helpful, but wants the information. The problem is, as a CEO, like one of your biggest resources is time, and so you kind of have to figure out. I mean, it's a similar thought process. It's like who's in the inner circle, who's not in the inner circle, and like how are you managing that? So we have a person, like it was one of those things where as you got big enough, having someone to sort of field some of the requests that were coming in that weren't incredibly valuable, figuring out how to communicate to them where they felt like they were getting enough information, but it wasn't going to like, particularly in competitive industries, you get worried that like it's going to get to someone who really didn't need it or want it or shouldn't have it. And then there's like, I sort of refer to as, there are investors that will be annoying. Like they'll be way more annoying than helpful. And I think sometimes those investors, it's helpful to actually have that direct conversation. Some of those investors don't know what being a good investor, they're typically perversely the person that put in like the smallest amount of money super early, but they've been supporters. It's not that, it's just, they don't know what to do. And so, sometimes you have to go to them and say, listen, you're coming to my VP of Finance, you're asking her a ton of questions on a monthly basis. Not one of them are helpful. So here's what we're gonna do for you. We're gonna make sure you get these quarterly updates, and like, if you need something very specific, please let her know, but like, here's, So it's like any other relationship, like managing that, being kind of direct with expectations. But the biggest thing is like setting the expectation. So what I found also is if you're not willing to continue it over, however long you're in business. By the way, I think a lot of us got into this being like, oh, cool, we'll do this for 2 years, big win, out. But so we didn't set it up for the long term, which was definitely my problem. But over the long term, if you're not willing to talk to someone every week, like maybe don't set that expectation. And so I think there's a little bit of that management at the beginning that I wish I'd done. That certainly, if I ever do this again, I will be sure to do.
I love it. Okay, I have a bunch more questions, but we have like 12 minutes left, so let me look around the audience. Anyone have anything specific? We've got a lot of expertise up here on the stage, so if there's specific questions people have, now is a good chance. There's a hand over there. Yes, there you go. You just shout it out. I'll repeat it. It's all right. All right. Or take the mic. That's even easier.
This question is specifically for Lee or anyone else who might find it relevant. But if I understand correctly, you started Havenly with your sister. And as somebody who has a lot of siblings, love them, but butt heads a lot, what advice would you have to give to somebody who is going to enter any business venture and scale that with their siblings? Any spicy anecdotes?
Super spicy anecdotes. So first advice is make sure you have a in-writing operating agreement, because when eventually one of you has to leave or you have to fire the other person, it's like written in writing, and that fight's a pretty bad fight. You get over it typically, but it can be like a pretty messy thing. It's funny. I do think a lot of people hesitate working with siblings or partners. But one of the benefits that I will say about working with someone like that is, in the beginning, speed is so paramount. And when someone can read your mind, which is often when you're close to siblings, they can do, you can actually make a ton of progress. The pitfall, by the way, of that, and this is actually why we end up bringing on Jesse, who I referred to earlier, is sometimes as siblings, you come from the same point of view. So your mental models are super similar. So you're not seeing around corners. So it's always helpful to have one other person, if they can stomach being in it, with 2 siblings, which, you know, again, the person we brought on was totally game for it, Jesse. But you kind of need someone else to like help see the world differently than you guys do, because you both grew up in the same place. But yeah, we got some fights, but then we made up, and overall, she texts me 1 million times a day now. I text her 1 million times a day now. It's all good. She is no longer with the company, though. She left. And I think that was probably for the better for both her and me and the company, ultimately.
An interesting question. Thank you for that. All right, who else has an interesting question? Or just any question? I can't see. Oh, there you go. Sorry. I was going to blame the poll, but turns out I can just look right at you and miss you.
Do you ever want to give up majority control of the board? I was in a meeting with some VCs and angels, and they were talking about getting control of the board so they could better direct the company. But like as a founder, where would you sit with that? And do you really want to do that?
Most boards are structured with more parity, right? I was laughing because of the construct of what that VC said, right? So they want a majority so they can guide the company, like red flags, sirens, like that's a bad signal. But most boards are structured initially to have some sort of parity, right? So there might be 2 founders, there'll be a board seat for, let's say, the 2 venture investors, and then an outside board seat. I don't know how you guys have felt, Natty and Kirk. I rarely worry about that. I'm on a lot of boards where we don't have control. And I don't really, like, my job is to exert influence on the things that matter through having experience in building relationships, right? And I find that's, I've been in venture for 22 years, Kirk, 24 years. I know that we share this one example together, because that was actually Dante. I've only seen one time where like something came down to an actual board vote. It ended up being before we invested in that company that sold 6 months later for 3 times. But there was an issue that came down to an actual board vote where the board was split and who had what vote mattered. But in 22 years, that was the only time. So I'm not saying the board control doesn't matter. I'm just saying I think sometimes it gets overplayed a little bit. And that's not always how you influence companies. And if you're controlling a company from the board, like, something else is wrong. Yes, question back there.
Yeah, thanks for talking with us here. If you were to have it all your way, how would you do it now? Like if you had an ideal situation, I guess Natty, since you've been on both sides, if you were to do it all over again, your first time founder, and you could have it all your way, how would you do it?
Sell for $1 billion in 2 months? I don't know. Give me a little more context. Like, what do you mean? Like, how would I set up my relationships with the investors? I don't know.
Yeah. Another entrepreneur asked, it was either Paul Graham or like one of them recently, and their advice was keep your team small, always surprise people with how many people are on your team, raise $500,000, and be good from there.
I mean, we could talk about this for a long time, but I think generally that's a good advice. I think the main thing I would say is optimize for the right people. Like, that's the only advice I'd say. Your investors, your teammates, your co-founders, your employees, your community, your mentors. At the end of the day, these businesses are built by people. You want to win with people. You want to look across the table when you're ringing the bell at the NASDAQ and be proud of the people and excited for the people that you brought along on that journey. So I think I'm not looking back and saying I regret that. I think the thing I did probably the best in my whole entrepreneurial journey was getting great people involved in my business. My business was a mediocre success, but the relationships I built, the people who worked with me, the people who I got to mentor, the people who mentored me, like, those have become lifelong relationships and are way more important than the business itself. And so that's what I would distill it down to for me.
We've got a lot. Anything else to add to that? Because we've got a lot of experience sitting here.
Oh, boy. I like investors. I really do. They're really great people. Some of them are close friends, but I probably wouldn't take outside investment again. That's just a personal thing. And actually, it ends up being like return math and stress and like where I am in my life. But if you are going to do it, and I lucked into this, if you are going to take investment dollars, this is not something I knew at the outset, but do the reference check on how investors act when you're not doing well. I didn't do that reference check. I lucked into those investors. Like, I lucked into investors. And by the way, if you follow our space, we're the only company still around, and I guarantee you that had more to do with my investors than it had to do with, than you'd think. The times when I find entrepreneurs getting into trouble and the times when I've gotten into trouble, it's when I didn't ask that very important question. Are they going to support you in the? Because everyone, Jeremy, you said this earlier. Everyone's great when it's great, right? But it's like how every business goes through ups and downs unless you sell in 2 months for $1 billion, which doesn't happen to a lot of people. How are they then?
Do you have a question, or you're just stretching? No, you have a question. Okay.
Yeah, question. So as you think about all of the decisions you've made with respect to investors and investment, is there a decision you've made that you look back and strongly regret? And if so, what did you learn from that?
I mentioned it a little bit, just sort of around taking capital from a Series B investor that just felt a little junior, and maybe vetting that a little bit more. But I'm happy it happened because I thought about it differently with the exit to PE. When we were looking into these 4 offers, I really wanted to get to know these folks, like under the lens of like I had a bad experience before. And fortunately, we're with a PE firm that acts very much like Foundry Group, which is the highest compliment I could ever give to an investor. I feel very differently than Lee. I would take outside capital 100 out of 100 times for my next thing, as long it was like Foundry capital, and I would avoid, at all costs, literally, even if the company didn't getting off the ground, then taking capital from the wrong people in the room. I'd rather not start the company.
I would say early in my career, I was willing to go invest in assholes because I thought we'd get a high IRR on that investment. And probably about 8, 9 years ago, I decided I'm never going to fund an asshole and work with an asshole anymore.
I love it. All right, anything else from the audience? We've got probably time for
we've got
more question.
2 over here.
Oh, there we go.
So VC requires a trajectory, high growth trajectory. High growth requires a mentality of move fast, break things. As technology matures as an industry, is that a responsible way to approach society when, for example, AI and all the complications that brings, is that a responsible way to treat society? And is that sort of mentality of move fast, break things, and hence get the high trajectory that we're looking for, is that a good thing?
I think it depends on who. Like, is it a good thing for who? Look, I don't think there's anything wrong with starting a lifestyle business that's not super high growth, that venture capitalists aren't going to invest in, but that could throw off, a couple $100,000 of cash flow or whatever. And I see a lot of my, friends that are starting, or have lifestyle businesses, and they don't want to go super fast and break things and, growth at all costs or almost all costs. And I think that's fine. I think if you raise venture capital, you subscribe to making those folks a good return on their investment. They're betting on you. And I think you have a responsibility to try to do everything you possibly can to make that a great outcome for your investors, your team, and everybody around. You should be responsible with it. I mean, I feel like there's some undertones of your question around people going past the line of efficacy, maybe, or stepping on people's heads just to get 1 inch higher, which is not the right way to think about it. But I think there's responsible ways to grow really fast and provide great returns and have a great journey.
I also think with every cliche, it's a cliche for a reason. And I'm not sure that I agree with the move fast, at least the break things part. Because I've seen so many companies be quick in terms of their work, but be responsible in terms of their work, right? So now, obviously, when you're talking about AI and broader question, clearly we don't know what the impacts of some of those things are going to be, or some of the technologies. But I don't think that's a break thing. I think that's we're exploring new territory. But I think the idea that we can accept mistakes because we're moving quickly is kind of BS. Like let's be a little bit more thoughtful and careful.
I do want to say, the thing that I think if you are considering how to fund your business, you should think about is, it's sort of a corollary to what what Jeremy said, but also, you know, a reference to what I had said earlier, which is like not every business should have venture, and not every entrepreneur should have venture. And you know, I see it most directly in the consumer space. If any of you follow consumer companies right now, it is like you can buy these like amazing. Yeah, you can buy like this fantastic female athleisure brand for like, you know, a couple $1 million. You know, it's like pretty gnarly out there. And like I think what ended up happening is venture became the only answer, and that I think probably went a little bit far. And so, you know, what I kind of like about this reset moment is I think we're being more thoughtful about who and what and when and what's the right profile for the entrepreneur and for the investor.
I think that's a great place to end because we're at Denver Startup Week, and I think there can be a temptation to think that startup means venture-backed startup or startup means technology startup. 99% of businesses in the United States don't take money from venture capitalists. So let that sink in for a second. Most of the businesses that, and by the way, 105 to 110% of all new hires in the US come from businesses in their first and second year. And again, most of those businesses are small business, right? 50% of employment, 40% of US GDP comes from businesses that are small businesses. So I think it's helpful to remember that at Startup Week, we embrace startups of all different types, right? Whether they someday will be venture-backed or they will never be venture-backed. So I think that that's really important. Please join me in thanking our panelists, Kirk, Natty, Lee, and Jeremy. This was excellent. Thank you.